Enjoy your free speech.
The US House Speaker faces anti-war protesters at Columbia University. Polls suggest an increasing number of young Americans are siding with Palestinians. So what's behind this generational gap in the US response to the war on Gaza? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. For decades, the United States has been Israel's biggest ally and military partner. Successive US administrations right across the political divide have backed it since it was created in 1948. Businesses, academia and the public have also largely supported Israel. But polls suggest that unequivocal backing now appears to be waning, especially among the young. A Pew Research study 2 years ago indicated only 41% in the age group of 18 to 29-year-olds had a favourable view of Israel. And many from this generation are now protesting in university campuses against the war on Gaza, which has killed nearly 35,000 Palestinians. So, is the anger among young Americans highlighting a generational divide in Washington's policy towards Israel? And what are the reasons reshaping public opinion? We'll explore these and other questions with our guests in just a moment. But first, this report from Katia Lopez-Horian.
There's been a generational divide in America's response to the war on Gaza. From college campuses to politicians in Washington, differences are emerging and widening a political rift among voters.
So, in essence, I think that Biden administration might just be putting their hands up and saying we're going to have to write off these voters that care deeply about this issue because there's no way that we can appease them.
We will continue to have Israel's back.
President Biden is facing criticism for his handling of Israel's war on Gaza from both the left and the right. And that could shake the strong support Israel has enjoyed in Washington for decades. Analysts say it's not just about generational differences, but also about changing worldviews on foreign policy and Israel, even before the war. A 2022 Pew survey suggests about 70% of Americans 65 and older had a favorable view of Israel, but support dropped nearly 30 percentage points with younger Americans aged 18 to 29.
When I was growing up, the Democratic Party was the party that supported Israel. 75% of American Jews vote for the Democratic Party. That is still the case, although I suspect it may not be in November of this year.
My message to the students inside the encampment is go back to class and stop the nonsense.
Republicans are denouncing the protesters and Biden's policies, but the president is also getting pushback from his own Democratic Party, with 57 members of Congress recently asking him to withhold aid to Israel.
It is a sign that the Biden administration is run by a man who is 81 years old, right? Because he is of the old school of the Democratic Party. Almost nobody who works for him is.
Despite criticism from both parties and young voters, Biden remains defiant.
Mr. President, have the protests forced you to reconsider any of the policies with regard to the region?
No.
For years, it's been the economy, not foreign policy, that's weighed more heavily with American voters. Now, some analysts say the war in Gaza may not play a defining role in November's presidential election, but it will likely have an impact. Katia Lopez-Horian, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
All right, let's bring in our guests now. In New York, we have Claire Davenport, a student at Columbia Journalism School. In London, Julie Norman, who's Deputy Director at UCL Centre on US Politics. And also in UK, in Leeds, there's Keir Milburn, who's author of Generation Left, which is a book which examines generational differences. Good to have you with us. A warm welcome to all of you. Claire, I'd like to start with you in New York, if I may. What, in your view, do you think is happening here? Why are the generations at odds over Israel, do you think?
I mean, I think this is something both new and old. You know, I mean, there was the protests at Colombia in the 60s against the war in Vietnam, in the 80s against apartheid in South Africa. So in some ways, I think it's not a surprise, that the war of this generation is something that university students want to contest and want to fight back against. At the same time, I think younger people are more looped in than ever before because of social media. I think there's also more of a growing awareness, of our global world and the problems within it and drawing lines between different issues. I know even in my own life, my younger cousins, will bring up issues like gentrification and colonization, things I certainly was not aware of when I was, in middle school and early high school. So I do think social media has played a role in that, and that greater awareness of different struggles, different histories around the world. But at the same time, I do also think, the urge to push back against war and America's ties to war, I think, are something we see time and time again play out on college campuses. So I think it's both, a new divide and an old divide.
Right. And I guess Israel's actions in Gaza have kind of supercharged the differences and the US's perceived role in that assault on Gaza, Claire.
Yeah, and I think there's much greater awareness, of the economics of all of this. I think thinking about our tax dollars, going to fund Israel and going to fund this war, and then thinking about Colombia, how the university's endowment is invested in different defense companies like Lockheed Martin or companies like Airbnb that operate within the occupied settlements in the settlements in the occupied West Bank. I think there's just a greater awareness of the money at play here, and I think capitalism and pushing back against capitalism is something younger generations have been feeling and talking about and saying more. And so I think this fits very much within that world of pushing back against trustees at the university, who have ties to these companies and these sort of BlackRock lists of investments that we don't have that much of an eye into.
Julie, we heard from Katya's report just now. It outlined just how old the president is, the US president is. And there's no doubt that the general perception of Israel's position has changed since Biden and his cohort grew up. Things do look very differently to someone born this century, don't they?
Absolutely. I think everything that Clara said is very right. And I think you add to that an issue like Israel-Palestine, where the conflict and the issue simply has changed over the decades. And as we heard in the report that started the show, many from Biden's generation, the so-called boomers, grew up seeing Israel as the underdog, the country that emerged after the Holocaust, the country that was needing to defend itself against aggression. I don't think it would be going too far to say it was almost the way many people see Ukraine today is how many in Biden's generation saw Israel. That's obviously changed. My students in university here in London, obviously students in the US have grown up with an Israel that's very different, that has a very different political scene, that has a very different position in the region. And they've seen this conflict play out with the Second Intifada, with the wars on Gaza preceding this one, and then, of course, the current conflict. So it's a very different image, I think, than, say, Biden, his generation, grew up with having of Israel.
Right, things have moved on. Keir, you write how age increasingly appears to be one of the key dividing lines in contemporary politics. But really, don't you think that's always been the case, especially with student activism? It's always been there, as Claire just outlined.
There has always been student activism. I think this wave of encampments is something we haven't seen on this sort of scale for quite a long time, probably going back to the 1980s. And in fact, I'd make an argument further than that generational political differences or significant generational political differences are not always there. They emerge and become significant only periodically, I think. And in fact, you can tie what's going on at the moment in this generational division on attitudes around perhaps Israel-Gaza, Israel-Palestine. You can tie that to a wider division along the lines of age or generation in terms of politics. And that emerged at a very particular point in history. It emerges in a really significant way, really grows massively across several countries, actually, at the same time in the early to mid 2000s. And I mean, if something happens on an international scale very suddenly, you would want to look at a sudden international cause for that. And I would argue that the financial crisis of 2008 is at the root of this emergence, because I think that the financial crisis of 2008, it affects you very differently if you're older and have assets such as a home, or if you're younger and you rely on income from work, or perhaps from state welfare, etc. Because what happens after 2008? Huge amount of financial support goes from the state to the financial sector. By proxy, if you're an asset holder, you do well out of that. At the same time, wages have been catastrophically performing since that point in the UK. 18 years of no wage growth. That's absolutely epochal. You haven't seen anything like that since Napoleonic wars. And so the prospects of young people sort of have diminished and maintained at a very low level since that time. The prospects for young people also, of course, complicated by climate change, which is going to make their lives poorer. There's no doubt about that. And I think that having a less settled state in the world as it exists opens you up, actually, to be more critical, to more critical views about the existing structures of the world. And I think that's part of what pushed younger generations to the left, or opened them up to the left and towards more structural critiques. And I think that carries over from something like.
Sorry to jump in. So do you think this is like a tipping point then, that we're beginning to, or on the verge of entering a new era? I mean, it's not just like the significant student protests of the past, but something different that's going to give them because everything you say and the financial crisis and everything that it led to means that their futures are a little more bleak, the youth of today. So what does it mean for their future?
I mean, so business as usual leads to somewhere very unpleasant for young people. I think we could put it that way, unless there are significant changes. And whether these encampments, this wave of protests, whether this could actually be what we might call a generational forming event, where a disgruntled generation actually form a coherent politics. It's too early to tell, but I think that's what happened in the wave of protests and, in fact, revolutions in 2011. If you remember the Occupy movement, that gave a real impetus. That caused, without a doubt, the sort of wave of left-wing electoral projects. Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, Bernie Sanders in the US, they were both defeated in 2020. And since then, there's been a little disarray, I think. But it could well be that this sort of event could be the spur to the next wave. That this could be the generational forming event of Generation Z, if you like. And it's very significant. It's around foreign policy, I think, and the role that the US plays in international structures.
Claire, would you like to come back on that? So this growing sense of despair among the young of today is driving this?
I mean, I certainly agree that it plays a role. I think, talking about climate change, talking about economic issues, mental health issues are also very much on the rise. And, we're still unsure the role social media is playing in that. But I do sense a growing nihilism, among young people, especially the millennial generation and the older Gen Z. I think some of the younger people, younger than that, still come with a bit of hope, come with a bit of energy. But I do think that there is this sort of streak of despair that is fueling some of this. At the same time, I wonder, if that is limited to the younger generation. Something I've been thinking a lot about is how more generally across age differences, we're moving to the left and to the right, as a society. We're growing more polarized. And I think, maybe one of the key differences is the language and some of the strategies of protest that are used. But talking about Israel, for instance, and I think to Julia's point, I think we're looking at a very different Israel today than we were 20, 30, 40 years ago. And I think I see across generations growing frustration with Israel and what they're doing right now in Gaza. I think there's very different expressions around that. I think older generations, for instance, are way less likely to embrace protest chants like from the river to the sea. But at the same time, I think I see, within my own life and family, even different perspectives on Israel than people used to have. And I think the protests as well, there's been across the country a huge support from professors and faculty for the students, coming out and forming barriers against the police. So I do think these things extend beyond just younger people. And I think that all of these same issues, climate change, economic issues, older generations see them as well, and I think are worried for younger people. And I do think that factors in.
Julie, would you like to come back on that and also take it on politically what this means for Joe Biden and upcoming elections?
Sure. Yes. Again, I just agree with what Claire said. Here in the UK, there is some campus activism, of course, but there have been essentially weekly large demonstrations and protests in London really since October 7th. And as Claire alluded to, those are quite intergenerational. So it's important, obviously, to see what's happening on the campuses and to look at that student movement, but also to see that this is broader and bigger than that with this issue and conflict. And getting back to the U.S., absolutely. I mean, Biden, I think, is really struggling with how to navigate this. And that has been really from day one, from October, with knowing, I think, that he would not be able to please all voters with whatever stance he took. I think he knows now that he will probably lose some voters, especially, the more young progressive voters on this issue. But at the same time, I think there was a sense that, going too far the other way would also, potentially lose voters who were more sympathetic to Israel. I also would just underscore, I think the policies that Biden has been trying to pursue in the Middle East are more focused on what's happening there than on the political landscape back home, though that is having an effect. And I would just point out, too, that, again, the campus youth politics is even somehow a bit different than where we're seeing priorities among the wider population. Polls have shown that even among the youth demographic, Israel-Palestine is still, I think, 15th out of 16 issues in terms of ranking. So I do think it's important, as Claire and Kira have alluded to, other issues are at play here also, the economy, domestic issues, and all of these are in the mix right now with what Biden has to consider for this election year.
Right, and Kira, another issue that is at stake here, the demographic changes are having an effect, aren't they? Playing a role in shaping public opinion, with younger generations perhaps being made up of larger percentages of racial minorities who are perhaps more historically sympathetic towards Palestinians.
I mean, that's certainly true in the US, and it seems to be playing a significant role in the makeup of the encampments at the campuses. And of course, the other demographic thing is that what we're seeing is that the playing out of the baby boomer generation, and the baby boomers are called that because there's a lot of them. There was a boom in births after the Second World War, which went up to around 1965 with the rollout of the contraceptive pill, where birth rates fell off a bit. And so we have been stuck in almost like a gerontocratic sort of society in which it's been very hard for younger people to assert themselves and assert their interests. I think we'd put it that way. And of course, that is likely to change, I think. I mean, it's likely to change over time. There's really significant problems here. One, the emergency, the horrific emergency sort of status of something such as Gaza, for instance, but also the pressing time scale of climate change means that we might be in a race, actually, for younger people to assert their interests and find political means to do that. And so encampments, which only include a very small part of the population of young people across the US, they can be sort of like the trigger moments, if you like. They're the ones who can forge a way and forge a new politics, which then disseminates amongst the wider population, both young and old. But of course, your material interests do play a role in whether you're receptive to those ideas or not, I think. Doesn't mean older people aren't going on the protests in London. I've been on them, and they certainly are. It's just, we need to take these sorts of demographic and political factors into account when we're trying to work out what's going on. Right.
Claire, what then can bridge these divides then as we get into an era where millennials are taking on leadership positions? I guess there'll be a kind of bridge between the boomer generation and the generations to come.
It's a good question. I mean, I always think, engagement, I think one of the drawbacks of social media and how interconnected we are online is I think there's, especially post-COVID, been growing isolation, with interpersonal interactions. I think you can even see this in, Israel itself, Israel-Palestine. I've read research, that in the past, Israelis and Palestinians used to see each other more, and now there's way less actual face-to-face interaction. And you're seeing people much more just as a figure online. So I think, building a sense of our collective humanity in that way and seeing each other and showing up for each other, I think that could certainly play a role in some healing. I also think, to the points earlier about, I think there's been, the political establishment at this moment is really almost kind of closing its eyes to how the public feels right now about this issue. And I think, perhaps Biden's own feelings about Israel play into this, but I think acknowledging, that things have changed and sentiment has changed, and we might very well be at this turning point. And I think similar, to after the Black Lives Matter protests, there was a real response from the political establishment to a certain extent, and at least an attempt, whether or not it was successful, to understand some of these issues and to grapple with some of them. And you're not really seeing that in the same way with this issue. Still, so many people on both sides of the aisle are staunchly in support of Israel and staunchly in support of U.S. support of Israel, and are really just not willing to question that. So I think that, that is really important for politicians to engage with where people are now, which is in a different place.
Julie, I spoke to a university professor yesterday who said that when he was teaching in the States for about 10 years, maybe a decade or so ago, that students would not have dared to raise their voice against Zionism in such a way, in such a prolific way. What's changed on that front, do you think?
Yeah, so I would say, a number of things have changed. As we've talked about, just the course of the conflict, I think, has shifted, and we see a much more, we see a lot more images of the Israeli actions in Gaza in particular that has been, I would say, escalating over the last 10 years. And obviously, in the aftermath of the October 7th attack, we've seen a very different kind of war. But that has changed over time. I think, as Claire mentioned, our students' access to the images of those wars and even the reality on the ground in between the wars is just much more visible. My students are following the war daily on TikTok. They're seeing live streamed images from everyday people. And so I think that has changed. And I think just the climate, again, on the campuses itself has changed. There has been a lot more, I think, solidarity movements, awareness to different issues and movements around the world, and students are taking those to heart, and I think trying to have a place in that. And that's maybe a little bit different than it was 10 years ago. That I would say, again, there's always been those movements. I remember 10 years ago, it was more like Occupy was kind of the big movement. So I think just the focus has shifted because of just the international resonance of what's happening right now.
And Julie, just quickly, just 30 seconds or so, would you say it's true to say that the differences that we're seeing are mirrored by divergences between older and younger Jewish Americans?
I think to some degree. I wouldn't want to say it quite that hard stroke, I think, but there's certainly been a divergence in that regard. And yes, I would just underscore the protests now are quite diverse in their makeup, and those who are counter-protesting and are upset with the protests are also quite diverse in their makeup.
Keir, something you've alluded to, but perhaps we can explore a little bit more. Do you think these moments of protest can mark a transition in collective social thinking, just take us towards a different viewpoint when these new generations take the helm?
I mean, yeah, I think they always, not everyone does, and not every instance of these sorts of protests does that. But the only thing that does that is these sorts of protests. If you know what I mean, they can be the spark that leads the way in which people then follow. I think you'd put it something like that. I think it's very hard to tell at the moment. The end of term is coming up. We don't know what's going to happen with those. We don't know what's going to happen with Israel's war on Gaza. So, it's too early to tell, of course. But the general outlook for young people, well, for all of us, but of course, for young people in particular, It is a crisis-ridden future that we're looking at the moment. In the UK, food prices are rising because of incredible rains, there's droughts. Climate change is having material effects. It's going to make us poorer. It's making us poorer today. At the same time, people who study contentious politics, they say contentious politics, social movements, they explode when the official political system is closed off to you. And that seems to be, particularly for perhaps the young cohort, the more left-wing part of the younger cohort, after Saunders and Corbyn were defeated, the political system seems to be closed off. In the UK, the political parties have moved much closer together. There doesn't seem to be much of a choice. And if you can't express your opinions and your interests through the political system, you tend to do it outside the political system in these big explosive social movements.
Claire, tell us, if you would, within the universities like where you are at Columbia, just how polarised it is and how much debate there is about this particular issue.
Well, it's funny, because you see the media reports and it's being painted in this very polarized way. And I really would say that's not been the mood on campus. I think there's been just quite widespread support, I think, for the protests, either, from people who believe in freedom of speech or people who believe in what they're actually pushing for. There certainly are some students and faculty, I think some who are very outspoken who aren't a fan of the protests. And I think, to Julie's point, these are very diverse groups of people. But I think that it's been painted, in this very divided way. And I think that there's a lot more solidarity on campus around, the rights of these protesters to express themselves, and a lot of solidarity and support with their messaging. We saw, just hundreds of people come out the other day and support when the encampment was, when the administration told the encampment they had to leave, and a lot of faculty support as well. And I would also like to make the point, kind of going off what Julie was saying, I think, it's being painted as this issue of anti-Semitism, and so many of the protesters are young Jewish people themselves. And so I think that framing just totally takes out some of the nuance of the situation and how young Jewish people themselves understand their role in these protest movements. So I think it's really important to name, 15 of the students who were arrested the other day, or not the recent round of arrests, but the first round of arrests, were Jewish students. And we don't have those numbers yet for the current round of arrests. But I just think that that's been a bit erased in some of the media framing. And I think it's important to kind of understand there is a lot of community solidarity on campus around the rights of these students to have a voice and to have a say. And I think that there's a lot of political eyes on this, and that's perhaps why, it's being painted in this more polarized fashion, but that really hasn't been the mood, on Columbia day to day.
Well, very interesting discussion, everybody. Much more to be said, but we've run out of time, I'm afraid. We'll be watching very closely here at Al Jazeera the direction this all takes. But thank you to Claire Davenport, to Julie Norman and Keir Milburn. Thank you. And thanks for watching. You can check out this programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nick Clark, and the entire team here, it's goodbye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.